just throw that out. Have I left any for those who know some information that needs to be conveyed? The speaker tonight is a lady who's been to all these lectures, and about every second one she would make a point of letting me know she would really like me to consider her as a speaker one day. And I kept thinking, I had all these speakers in the queue and I couldn't get to her fast enough. And it just felt like, well, you know, because I asked her, what is your topic? And she said, death. Death and grieving and mourning practices of the Civil War. And as it began to unfold, I was like, this could be really interesting. And as it just coincidentally had to happen this year, it's right during the month of Halloween. And so it all sort of fit. So we're so happy to have her here tonight. Local living historian Betty Schiedler has been a student of the Civil War for more than 10 years, earning continuing education certificates from the American Battlefield Trust. She has traveled to many locations to perform living history. Her favorite persona is Frances Steptoe Burwell of Avenel Plantation in Bedford, Virginia. Betty is also a tour planner and has led group tours to many locations, including Newmarket, Sharpsburg, or Antietam, Harper's Ferry, Saltville, Culpeper, and Fredericksburg, to name but a few. She has been a docent at the Jubal Early Home Place over in Hardy and has been a volunteer with the Shenandoah Valley Battlefield Foundation. She also, and I was talking with other members here, she's also a member of the local Civil War Roundtable, so I'd like to put in a plug for them. Please help me welcome Ms. Betty Schiedler.
Thank you. I'm going to take this off. It makes it a little bit easier to read. And I'll be talking about this a little bit later. So I do want to do a couple of shameless little plugs and so on. First of all, Kevin Donovan is here, as well as some other members of the Roanoke Civil War Roundtable. And we've got some information on the table. Please go and browse the table. I've got some samples of mourning wear and jewelry. I've got some pictures, my primary sources. I've got a few of them over there. And so most of them are letters, diaries, and so on, that they've served me in gathering my information. I'm also going to say, so I've got some material over on the table as well about, I've forgotten his name, I'm sorry, it's just gone out of my head, who wrote a beautiful letter to his wife. He knew that he was going into a horrific battle, that he probably wouldn't survive, so he wrote a letter home to his wife. It's very famous. I've also got a little bit of information. I adapt my talks to suit the audience and the season and so on. When it's Women's History Month, I add a lot about specific women who were very courageous during the Civil War. There's information about them. The Friends of Lucy Breckenridge, that's a group that I belong to. We are having a birthday celebration for Jubal Early this coming Sunday at his home place in Hardy. So we will have Civil War era music, live fiddle music. We'll have a food truck selling German food. General Early will be there. We'll have Civil War encampments, ladies in period attire, and so on. It's free, open to the public. So if you've got some time on Sunday between 1 and 5, we'd love to have you. I appreciate you letting me just talk about that. So, as Stephen said, so I've been studying the war, for the Civil War, for, well, now about 13 or 14 years. And a number of years ago, I was thinking, you know, I love the battles and so on, but it gets a little tedious after a while, and I really wanted to know what the civilians felt, how the women were, and so on. And that's really where my focus has been for the past number of years. And so I'm going to be talking to you, and I hope everybody can hear me okay. I'm going to be talking to you about death and mourning in the Civil War. So in colonial times and prior to the Civil War, funerals were very private family affairs. Family members were left to dress and prepare the body, which was often wrapped in a shroud. They were very quiet, somber events. The night before the funeral, many Puritan families would sit up and they'd watch the deceased. They actually, it was quite common for them to touch, to really view it, and they held visitations or wakes, and they wanted to ensure that the deceased really was dead. That was a common problem that they were concerned about. So the deceased body was displayed in the home parlor, or even a room where children were sleeping. And because of decomposition, funerals had to be held quickly. Many communities had groups of women who helped lay the dead to rest, and death, as you can imagine, was no stranger to the living. Child-infant mortality was very high. Women died in childbirth routinely, and then many more died of diseases of the day. And during this time, the belief was one of a good death, ars moriendi, or the act of dying. And the Victorians were champions at mourning. Public mourning was a crucial part of social etiquette, and for the upper and middle classes, mourning followed strict multi-stage rules which varied in length depending on your relationship to the deceased. The good death is based on the premise that a person is ready for death, the dying expected to be surrounded by loved ones, prayers would be offered up, and they would be buried in either a family plot or a church cemetery. It was thought that the person dying would apologize for wrongs they had done during their lifetime, or impart some words of wisdom that one only really learns when you're close to death. And certainly a wife was expected to sit beside her husband's bedside, hold his hand, and watch him die after a long and fulfilling life. If one had led such a life, they would undoubtedly be rewarded with a pain-free life in heaven, whole in body, and recognizable upon being reunited with loved ones. And the hope, of course, was that death was not an ending, but the beginning of life with God. Funeral services were held either in a home or a church. A procession would be assembled that they would accompany the deceased body to the cemetery to be buried. A traditional light meal would be served. Wealthier households, a large spread would be provided. By the early 19th century, colonial burying grounds and churchyards located in towns and cities were becoming overcrowded and neglected. And these cemeteries were full of images of skulls, crossbones, skeletons, and other symbols of fear. Sit down. To counter this, and in keeping with romantic sentiments of the Victorian age, the rural cemetery, set away from town, emerged. Planners designed these cemeteries as park-like settings that encouraged visitors to wander paths, contemplate the solemnity of death, and feel God's presence in nature. Indeed, these cemeteries became our first public parks, and picnickers and nature lovers alike enjoyed strolling through the grounds. Ornamental benches, fencing, urns, ponds, gardens, paved pathways, and cemetery art were new features of these cemeteries, making a more comfortable setting. The fear was no longer of death, but of having lived undesired, and unlamented. It was becoming important that mourners go to great lengths to demonstrate their open love and affection for the deceased. And although people were spiritual and attended church, there were some superstitions. So the deceased was carried out of the home feet first, so they weren't able to look back and beckon someone to follow them in death. Mirrors were covered until after the funeral, so that the deceased spirit could not be trapped in the mirror, or that a mourner seeing his or her reflection, they didn't want to follow them in death. Clocks were stopped in order to ward off bad luck. Family photographs were placed face down to protect people from being possessed by the deceased. Wreaths decorated in black crepe were placed on entrance doors so passers-by would know of the death. And some wealthier families even had a death door, since it was considered bad luck to remove a body through a door that was used for the living. Other customs included cutting locks of hair from the deceased and making jewelry from the hair or placing the hair in a locket. Death masks of the deceased were made soon after death as practicable, so as to avoid swelling and to capture a truer image. These were 3D images of the deceased, and photographs of the dead were also made, and often in lifelike poses. Funeral rituals would change over the years to become lavish funerals that would be more common in the Victorian era, particularly after the death of Queen Victoria's husband Albert in December 1861, which of course coincided that the war had only been going on a very short time. And being heavily influenced by Queen Victoria, wealthy and middle-class women in the United States would follow her lead in mourning rituals. Mourning attire, jewelry, and extensive use of black clothing and home decor became standard practice during this time. And with the arrival of the Civil War, the notion of a good death would become impossible because men were killed suddenly and often with no time to prepare for death. What started out as a lark for many would eventually claim the lives of approximately 750,000 men. Nobody could have predicted that the war would drag on for 4 long years, or that battles such as Shiloh, Stones River, Antietam, or Gettysburg would bring devastating death and destruction. So the American Civil War was the first modern war. I'm going to talk about that, what I mean by that. So new weapons were being created they fired faster, they traveled over longer distances. They included landmines, hand grenades, and torpedoes, as well as the infamous mini-ball, which actually caused over 90% of all wounds. Doctors knew very little about how to treat injuries sustained as a result of a mini-ball strike, and these new weapons caused massive injuries to soldiers, with resulting difficulty or even impossibility of identifying bodies. With the invention of the daguerreotype and collodion processes, both in 1839, and then the ambrotype, the Civil War was the first war that was covered by news reporters and photographers. Northern journalists, such as Matthew Brady, Alexander Gardner, and Timothy O'Sullivan, were in the fields of battle using these new processes to photograph the horrific reality of the battlefields. For photographers from the South, their work was made much more difficult, mainly due to blockades. This caused an economic crisis for Southern photographers. Indeed, according to scholar Bob Zeller, South Carolina-based photographer George S. Cook was the only Southerner who managed to make and sell stereographs throughout the war's duration. Pictures were highly published in newspapers and magazines. The telegraph had been invented in the 1830s, and this allowed immediate communication for military commanders as well as newspaper men who were able to relay information to hometowns. And just so again, there are various reasons why there are so much more information about the Union than the Confederacy, the pictures, the records, everything, and that's one of the reasons. They just, because of the blockade and so on, it just caused really hard problems. So we'll see a change in visual art as well, in that paintings that had previously been filled with romanticized ideals of love, life and death, and how God was seen in everything, that changed during the war. Artists such as Martin Johnson Head and Frederick Edwin Church expressed their views through landscape painting. It would be the first time that this genre of art depicting raging floods, erupting volcanoes, comets, and auroras splitting the skies portrayed destruction and emotion that the landscape painters picked up on, and their works became the emotional barometer for the mood of the country. Other artists and illustrators, such as Thomas Nast, Eastman Johnson, and particularly Winslow Homer, focused their art on the human side of war, such as the soldiers, children, slaves, and so on. And actually, I just want to let you know there's a display of Winslow Homer's work at the Taubman Museum on November 7th. I don't know if it will be his Civil War work. He certainly had other, but I would suggest it's a free event. So if you'd like to go see that, November 7th. We would also see a change in our literature as authors like Louisa May Alcott, Walt Whitman, Henry Timrod, and Emily Dickinson, as well as post-war author Stephen Crane, whose epic novel, The Red Badge of Courage, which was published in 1895, depicts the violence and psychological trauma of war. And along with black writers such as Harriet Jacobs, Elizabeth Kegley, Frederick Douglass, and William Wells Brown, who wrote of the horrific experiences of enslaved people and their pursuit of freedom. With the large number of deaths, it was necessary to have coffins mass-produced, which sparked a revolution in funeral arrangements. Because of the massive scale of death and the fact that so many sons and fathers died so far away from home, the original funeral director was born. With men dying hundreds and even thousands of miles away from home, strangers increasingly performed many of the rites associated with death. The war would bring about the growing appearance of morticians, or funeral directors, as I mentioned, as we know them today, who used their homes as the viewing locations. So you see it switching from the home to the funeral director's home. As deaths increased over time, funeral homes were accepted by families. The Civil War saw the growth of coffin and casket makers, and here's an advertisement for a burial casket. Metal coffins were introduced to the Civil War, but were extremely heavy. They weighed up to 300 pounds, that's without the person inside, and they cost about $40 or $50, so they really only started gaining popularity about the time of World War I. There was no plan for identification of the dead. It was the responsibility of the commanding officers to make a list of deceased soldiers, but this often proved difficult as few soldiers had a form of identification on them, and the sheer numbers of dead made this difficult, if not impossible. There were no dog tags per se. However, soldiers became accustomed to sewing their names into their uniforms, in the event they were killed in action. Sometimes the personal effects that the soldier carried, they had pictures, they had Bibles and so on. That helped sometimes with identification. And Union soldiers were often provided with identification tags. These were provided by the U.S. Christian Commission, but those were actually only for the Union soldiers. But that helped identify. Preparing bodies for transport home. This is one of my favorite subjects, embalming. So prior to the Civil War, it was really only used in medical training. But it became necessary during the war as families wanted to bring their loved ones home for burial, and they also did it to prepare them for transport. Now, in the period of the Civil War, arsenic was one chemical commonly used, or a combination of arsenic and soap was used to clean out the inside of the body to prevent both decomposition and infestation of insects. Other chemicals used included zinc, turpentine, creosote, and alcohol. The use of these chemicals, as you can imagine, made it very dangerous for the people who were doing the embalming. The Confederate Army declined to use this type of embalming. And formaldehyde, which became popular later, it had not yet been invented. Thomas Holmes, who would become known as the father of modern embalming, he offered to prepare the body of the first Union officer killed in battle. That was Colonel Elmer Ellsworth. Thomas Holmes is said to have embalmed over 4,000 soldiers for a price of $100 each, an enormous amount for the time. There's always somebody in every tragedy trying to take advantage. Because the cost of embalming was beyond the means of most soldiers' families, it's estimated that only about 40,000 soldiers were actually embalmed. Now, embalming became more popular after the death of President Lincoln, and since government officials wanted to have the president's body on display during that 2-week procession, they re-embalmed his body at every single stop so that he retained a lifelike appearance. So every single time. There was no official method of notifying next of kin. This often fell to fellow soldiers of the deceased who would take it upon themselves to let the families know of the noble death of their loved ones. Often, a family would not know that their loved one had died and would wait for months, sometimes even years, for news. Death notices were posted in local newspapers, although this information was often incorrect, since, as I mentioned previously, identification wasn't always correct. In March 1865, Claire Barton received permission to open the Missing Soldiers Office. When she finished her work in 1868, she and her staff had been able to determine what had happened to more than 22,000 soldiers, including 13,000 Union soldiers who had died at Andersonville Prison. There were no comparable offices in the South. Remember, the Confederate government ceased to exist after the war, although Miss Barton was able to get some names. Also having a huge impact on women was the sheer number who found themselves widowed as a result of the large death toll. During the 4 years of the war, approximately 3 million husbands, fathers, sons, uncles, and brothers left for war. And that was the equivalent of about 10% of the population of the entire country. With a death toll of 750,000, that meant that the same number of American families would never see their loved one's face again, as the men often died far from home. So it's estimated that 200,000 women became widows as a result of the Civil War. That is more than any other war in our country's history. This also means that the number of children orphaned by the war would be as high as, it could be 400,000 or 500,000 children, if we take the statistics that I'll talk about in a couple of minutes. So it was just devastating. In February 1867, Congress would pass the National Reburial Initiative, whose purpose was to provide authority and funds necessary to establish national cemeteries with common landscape designs. Oh, sorry, this was the children, the orphans. Cemeteries were established at battlefield sites such as Fredericksburg and Richmond, Virginia, Chattanooga and Shiloh, Tennessee, and numerous other places where federal dead still lay scattered in nearly forgotten graves. Indeed, when Abraham Lincoln gave his Gettysburg Address in November 19, 1863, there were bodies scattered around many of the battle sites, unburied and rotting. $4 million was spent to accomplish this, which is about $75 million in today's money. There was no such accommodation for Confederate soldiers, who often lay in shallow graves on battlefields, waiting to be found and transported to their homes. The idea of a body resting far from home, or worse, in enemy soil, was unacceptable. The task of bringing a loved one's body back home fell on women, and this work began once she had a place to mourn. If a widow could manage to locate the body, she felt a responsibility to bring him home, to be close to family and those who knew him. So this became the task of Southern women, who formed memorial associations and ladies' aid societies. The first such society was formed in 1865 in Winchester, Virginia. By 1868, there were 20 such organizations, many of them in Virginia. One group that made great strides in locating and reburying the Confederate dead was the Ladies Hollywood Memorial Association, who brought back and reburied approximately 3,000 Confederate soldiers from the fields of Gettysburg. They were able to raise funds primarily through private donations. In 1906, the Commission for Marking Graves of Confederate Dead was established by Congress to identify and mark the graves of Confederates who died in northern prisons and national cemeteries. I'll speak very, very briefly about mourning clothes. So widows were expected to respect a minimum of 2 years in mourning. In the period immediately following the death of her husband, a wife embarked on full or deep mourning, and this is what I would, a widow would have worn, in which she was compelled to wear only black clothing and to keep her face concealed with a black crepe veil when she left her home. She would wear this type of mourning for father, mother, grandfather, grandmother, husband, wife, brother, and sister. This was all according to the Gentleman and Ladies Book of Politeness, and confirmed by George Winfred Hervey in the Principles of Courtesy. So they actually had books and magazines to tell them what they should be wearing and how they should behave and so on. And a widow in deep mourning could not go out in public except to attend church. Next came a period as known as second mourning, during which the widow continued to wear black or solid dark colors, lavender, gray, and some purples. The veil could be lifted, so she's probably not wearing this. She's probably wearing like the one that's on the table, or that like Mrs. Breckenridge is wearing here in the front row. Because your veil could be lifted, and she does have a bonnet. That would, like I said, that's in the second stage. She wouldn't have been able to wear a bonnet in the early stages. You could wear lighter shades of lace and cuffs allowed, and that stage lasted for 9 months. Finally, we have the half mourning. That was between 3 and 6 months in length, and you could have a little bit more elaborate trim, decorate a dress, and accent colors such as white, purple, mauve, gray, and dark red were popular. Now for women, you can imagine, this meant stocking their armoires with mourning fashion, which was more readily available in the North, even though its death rate was 1/3 of that of the Confederacy. And stores like Lord and Taylor opened a mourning store where new widows could dress their grief fashionably. Godey's Ladies Book, which is the equivalent of today's Vogue magazine, regularly printed drawings of bonnets, collars, sleeves, breakfast caps, and a variety of mourning dresses for all occasions. Now, widows of Union soldiers from the big cities were also known to wear more flamboyant widow's weeds than did their equals in the South. Enslaved blacks working in wealthy homes also would have worn black clothing. Jewelry, was forbidden unless it was made of accepted material, and that is jet. And I think Mrs. Breckenridge also has some jet, maybe she'll show you later. Or you could have a token containing a lock of the deceased's hair. And I actually have one over on the table if you want to see a little sample. Widows corresponded only, I think I have pictures of that jewelry, actually. Sorry. Did I miss it? I guess I missed it. Okay. Sorry about that. But you can see the real thing. So, despite suggested protocol, how can one determine the correct period of mourning for a widow? Many widows, like Mary Todd Lincoln, Mary Anna Jackson, chose to wear mourning attire for the remainder of their lives. George Winfred Hervey said in Principles of Courtesy, "There should be nothing in mourning but what is natural and spontaneous. It is equal dissimulation to conceal the sorrow we feel and to feign the sorrow we cannot feel. Besides, what is more absurd than weeping by rule and wearing mourning according to a fashion?" So who were these women? I think I should, let me go through this and see what we've got. Here are some widows at graveside, and some more, just showing you what the fashions would be. Here's actually an example of your advertisement for mourning clothes. You can see it was big business. Here's the jewelry. I apologize. Ann Turner and Linda Breckenridge provided some jewelry that I took pictures of so that you can see what they look like. And here's your mourning stationery. I do have a couple of samples over on the table as well. For Virginia women, I'll get to this part in just a minute. For Virginia women who were married to Confederate soldiers, the women generally were married only about 6 years and were 27 years old. In a time when families were composed of 6 to 10 children, these widows really only had a median number of 2 children due to their very short marriages. The youngest widows were most likely to marry again, which is a vital necessity for survival, but they found a shortage of men created by the war, So they therefore had to marry men that were either much younger than themselves or older, and it was almost impossible to find a man of your same demographic and class background. Middle-aged widows were far less likely to remarry. That's mainly due to the fact that they had family, adult children who could take care of them, and they were likely to own property. So if they didn't remarry, that was their own choice. There was very little opportunity for women to work outside the home in the South due to its rural economy. If they did find work, it was probably as a dressmaker or weaving or spinning cloth. Pensions offered to Southern widows was quite small compared to their compatriots in the North, who received about 3 times more from the federal government. By 1888, in Virginia at least, the state had begun to create a pension system that allotted annual payments not only to disabled veterans, but to the widows of deceased soldiers. So by the end of the war, approximately 179,000 black men were serving in the military. That was about 10% of Union troops. Nearly 40,000 died as a result of disease or battle wounds. Enslaved blacks were allowed to mourn their dead. However, these were not sad events, but joyous occasions celebrated with food, dancing, and singing. Community involvement is essential to show support for the bereaved. The deceased no longer had to endure pain, hardship, and injustice. First and foremost, it was the celebration of the person being free. To this day, these funerals are considered homegoings, emphasizing the deceased soul return to home. And I actually just recently attended one, and it was a joyous celebration. Very happy event, because that person was going home to be with the Lord. The women were still in charge of planning the funerals and the rituals associated with death. They would invite all their friends, relatives, and neighbors. Weather played a very important role. Sunny days were preferred. They thought that if it was raining or storming, that the devil was coming to take the deceased soul. Those women also wore black, although the color blue played a large role. So they wore blue glass beads as adornment. In cemeteries, blacks not only used floral arrangements and markers similar to their white counterparts, but the graves were